This is me. This tells the brief overview. I use the term visual storyteller, which, as I go through my presentation, will explain how I've gone from studying architecture to styling, to design, to becoming an art director, and how I use the term visual storytelling to encompass what it means when I curate and when I work with brands, galleries, artists and artistes, musicians, in terms of communicating their story. I grew up in South East London. I don't know where all of you are from, but I was born in Plumstead, moved to Brockley when I was about 8, went to a local comprehensive, got to 15, decided that I hated secondary school, didn't want to do A-levels. Went to see my careers officer, who never turned up for my careers appointment. 3 weeks went by, and then made another careers appointment. He didn't turn up to that either. So I decided that I wanted to go to college. Knew I wanted to do design, probably interiors or architecture. And so I managed to, back then, pre-internet, there was a book called Yellow Pages. Some of you might have heard of it. That was the internet like 20 odd years ago, 25 years ago. And so that's what I used to find various different design courses. So there's a course called, it was Interior Design at London College of Furniture in Bow, between Bow and Mile End. So I went there, and because I had no careers advice, I'd never been outside of school properly for anything like this. The day I was going for my interview, it was pouring with rain. I never had a portfolio because no one told me what a portfolio was, 16 years old. So my work was wrapped in a black dustbin liner. So I turned up, one of the youngest people to go for this BTEC in interior design. And I got accepted on the course. And so this kind of rubbish bag kind of sums up my story. Not that my work's rubbish, but it kind of embodies kind of the beginning of my journey, and also that point where my aesthetic is very DIY and how you kind of put various different things together to make your work come more to the fore. So studying interior design was studying architects like British architect Nigel Coates, who would do bars like this, this was Cafe Bongo in Tokyo, which had been designed in the 80s, and I was studying late 80s, early 90s. And so I got a real love and kind of passion for Japanese architecture and the Japanese club scene and music and so forth. And so I set myself on this path, and that's the kind of thing that I thought I was going to be doing, or what I really wanted to do was design commercial interiors for bars, clubs, hotels and restaurants. So I left London College of Furniture and applied to go to Birmingham University, didn't get a place, then went back to North London, didn't get a place, then went to Teesside in Middlesbrough. They offered me a place, and it was a really good course. And the following week, Birmingham then got in contact and said, "We'd like to take you." But being the stubborn-headed person that I am, I said, well, if I wasn't good enough for you when you interviewed me first time round, I'm not going to take it. So I then went to Teesside for 3 years, spent 3 years hating it. But through that period, I met, still today, some of my best friends. And most of them were graphic designers. So even though I was then doing a degree in interior architecture and design, the people I was hanging out with were graphic designers. I was into fashion and style, but there was no kind of fashion courses where we were studying. So I learned about designers like Swifty. Swifty was the designer who designed this magazine on the right, Straight No Chaser. He'd studied under Neville Brody. And then the magazine on the left, obviously, is The Face. And again, it was the graphics and the style that came through magazines like The Face, and the photographers and the stylists that worked in magazines like that. So even though I was studying architecture, I was looking really at graphics and club culture. Late 80s, early 90s, it was a time where, I guess, hip-hop and young London and black culture, Jamaican culture were coming to its fore. This cover on the right, Get Yourself Together, was also designed by Swifty. And Swifty has pretty much defined a certain era of graphics and design for the past 30 years, essentially, through labels like Talking Loud, which was Giles Peterson's original label, through to Mo Wax, which is James Lavelle, and all the other stuff that he's done since then. So this single cover was quite important, and also what was coming out of Bristol with Massive Attack. Massive Attack single cover or album cover for Blue Lines was designed in conjunction with Judy Blame, who's quite an important stylist, creative artist, who I'll mention a bit further, but there's a certain line or way of working where some of the people that I've aspired to work with and have worked with share similar aesthetics, or I've shared or been inspired by their aesthetic and have developed my own visual identity through a similar approach to working, albeit the output is very different. So Judy, with his cut and paste and DIY style, worked with Michael Nash Associates and came up with the concept for the Massive Attack Blue Lines album. Underneath it's got Gulf War on there. The Gulf War was happening at the time when Massive Attack's album came out, and I remember at the time the government had put out a writ that asked Massive Attack to remove the word attack from their album because they were saying that anything that would be inflammatory within culture would help incentivize people who would be wanting to be warmongers. So there was a period where they then did a second release which was just called Massive, but then went back to the original Massive Attack album. Upon leaving Teesside, my 3 years came to an end. I couldn't get a job just doing interiors straight away, so I set about working with a couple of friends, designing club interiors or props and visuals for clubs, and then doing some boutique windows for fashion stores in places like Covent Garden. And at the time, Thomas Heatherwick, who most of you must know because he's designed all of those some nice, some horrible buses that are around London. I only say horrible because the air conditioning never works. But he did this window for Harvey Nichols, and this was a bit of a seminal piece. It was one of the things that really inspired, because it's that point where it's part window display, it's part architecture, it's part design, it's what you could almost call it costume. It was based around a sewing needle and this 3D sculpture that would go in and outside of buildings. So as I go through some of this stuff, obviously it's not my work, but it's things that have inspired the journey and for me to be at this point. Spent ages doing loads of club interiors and stuff, but I never ever had any money. So it was that point where I started to reflect and look about what can I do that's going to be a little bit different or that's going to be able to earn me some money, seeing as wasn't able to get an interiors job, and the club interior stuff was quite ad hoc in the way that it works. So I saw some of Judy's work in a magazine. His phone number was in there. I rang him up and he said to me, if you really want to come and work with me, send me an interest in fax. And for those of you that don't know what a fax is, no, some people do not know what a fax is. So a fax machine, again, pre-internet. I sound like I'm 95, but the fax machine was a machine where you could ring people and then send images or text down the telephone wire, and this roll of paper would come out. So I did a collage, which I sent to Judy, then called him a few days later. He said, love what you did. Come and do a project with me. Judy commissioned me to create some headdresses for a show that he was art directing and styling. I'd never made a headdress in my life before. I'd never done anything like that. I'd made props for these windows or for these club interiors, but it was quite brutalist stuff that we found on the streets and then resprayed up. It wasn't anything refined. But it was back in the day where people would give you the opportunity. They like what you do. They like you've either inspired them or you've got something. It's that very much can-do attitude. So he gave me the opportunity. I created, I think it was 8 headdresses out of leather and feathers for this project that he was doing. And it was at that time, the image on the left is reminds me of a shoot that he did for Idea around the time, which was, this isn't actually from that shoot, but it's in reference to. He did a shoot which was all about these models which were covered all in their high-end clothes, but then their faces were covered in oil and water. And it was his kind of poke or talking point about how we need to look at the environment and how so much wastage, how much we consume and then push back out into the seas. I remember at the time he got a lot of backlash from designers by them saying to him, you've gone too far, you shouldn't be doing this. Fashion is fashion, but you're not meant to have a political voice. But it was that point which made me realise that whatever it is that I want to do, through my art form and the way that I work, politics is quite important, or the environment, humanity, culture, people are really important to me. So at that point, that's kind of what sowed little seeds in the way that I work. The other thing that was quite key that I was learning about back then was Buffalo. Judy was part of the Buffalo Collective. Buffalo, for those of you who don't know, and if you don't know, you should be ashamed of yourselves, you should know. Buffalo was launched by Ray Petrie, the late, great, probably the most important stylist in my mind that has ever lived. Ray Petrie took street culture, he took high-end culture, and he would mash it all up. For you, that seems really normal because everyone does it these days, but back in the early 80s, no one was doing that. If you had GQ or you had Vogue, it was tailoring in GQ, and it was like fancy dresses in Vogue. So Ray was one of the first stylists with this Buffalo aesthetic, which was looking at Jamaicans, Jamaican culture. One of the first stylists to start putting black models in mainstream fashion magazines and just completely mixing things up. Buffalo, the term, was taken from the Parisian security crew who still do most of the fashion shows in Paris. If you go to Paris next week for women's wear, the Buffalo security still do shows up to this day. And so Ray took the name Buffalo from the guys, because Jack, who runs Buffalo security, called it that. There then became the tail off where obviously Nena Cherry, who was also then part of the Buffalo crew, did that song Buffalo Stance. So you then start to see that kind of journey point where collectives who used to get together, coming out of punk, Judy was punk, Ray probably wouldn't have called himself punk, but it's that point where it's very much it's DIY, what's available, what's accessible. It doesn't have to be big, fancy labels in order for you to create stuff to be able to move forward. Again, around that time, after meeting Judy and working with a few other people, Judy introduced me to a brand called Boudica, and I made some headpieces for them. I remember being at home one day and watching the video Street Spirit, which is directed by Jonathan Glazer, the Radiohead video. And I remember sat on my floor back at my mum's watching this video and being really inspired and thought, actually, I really want to do something which involves film and something that would be involved in really creating really heavy, full-on visuals. Which that then led me to starting to assist a lot of stylists. I really wanted to do fashion, but couldn't actually get a foot in the door, or a lot of the magazines that I would go to would often be asking you to do things for free. And I always thought they were trying to pull a fast one. And so I and I also needed to earn money. I wasn't a rich kid who could afford, mummy and daddy couldn't afford just to keep me swanning around fashion shows and PRs. So I needed to go and work. So I started assisting a number of music stylists, and that led on to a really successful career still to this day, where I still have a number of musical clients. I've reduced the amount of work that I do with, say, celeb musical clients, because the climate and the way that music works has completely changed. But I've worked with numerous people, from Pharrell to Kasabian. I'm working with Kasabian at the moment. We're about to shoot their new album cover at the end of this week. Here we've got Damon Albarn and his solo project. I work with Blur, and then there's Erica Badu for this creative direction project that I brought Erica over to Amsterdam for the launch of this hotel. But where we go. So then the music then led on to me still really into the fashion side and really into kind of a really strong visual aesthetic. Often when you're working with bands, sometimes you feel like you're styling by numbers, because you'd get, whether it's pop or indie, there'd be an identikit way of working. So if you was working with indie and rock bands, it'd be very much you're the person that comes up, makes them look really cool, but it also makes them look like they haven't even had a stylist. So it's not about the big show and tell of it, or you work with the pop artists, and maybe it's a bit more in your face and a bit more obvious, but it was always very much, there's so many cooks when it comes into kind of making the broth for music, and the way that when you work on music projects, you have record labels, production managers, the artist, the management, the photographer, the director, and then there's yourself who's got an opinion as well. So sometimes in the early days working in music became quite frustrating, because And it's not about having only about my voice, but when there's too many voices, obviously things don't work as well because no one can make a really clear decision. So I got to meet this really amazing designer and creative, Reem Al-Assadi, who ran a stall on Portobello Market. And for probably a good decade, Reem had the most sought-after stall at Portobello on a Friday and Saturday. Fridays used to be the day that everyone would go to Portobello, as in all of the stylists, all the big fashion houses and fashion brands, and hers would be the #1 stall because it was the way it was curated and the way that her aesthetic was put across. It always had an element of Victoriana, but then always be an element of military, and the way she would style her stall, it felt like you were going into this crazy emporium. And so Reem and I became friends over a number of years, and it became so successful, and then she started taking what she did, this stall and the tent that she would create, to Tokyo, and they did that for about 3-4 years. Then it got to the point it was like, what do you want to do next? It's time for you to start. Where do you go from this? So she said, well, let's start doing collections. And she consulted for a number of brands, from the likes of John Richmond and Stella McCartney and Lanvin and various other people. So really creative and talented in her own right, but knowing full well that you can't do everything yourself. She asked me to come along, being a good friend, and she trusted me and what I would do to be the stylist for her shows. So since the early 2000s, I've been going to Tokyo and working initially with British designers and styling their collections, and styling, again, in that very much DIY. The way that I work when I get to do shows, very often it isn't usually just going to be jacket and trousers or top and skirt. It's going to be way more involved. You'll have a say in the design. We'd be draping the garments and recreating a lot of these things. A lot of these pieces started off as Victorian originals and then would then be recreated into new pieces. This collection was called Charlie Says. I think this was the second or third show that we did in Tokyo, and then here's a few more images. And so the outfit on the right is a series of Victorian gloves which have all been intricately sewn together, and then underneath you've got a Victorian bustle which has then had French antique lace re-put into it. So it's a mixture between what Reem's found and then what we would do together with the team, recreating these pieces and then dip dyeing in order to put this collection across. But again, it's mixing all the materials, mixing all of the references. So I worked with Reem for about 5 years in Tokyo till she stopped doing shows in Tokyo, then worked with another brand. And then 2-3 years ago, I got to work with Takeo Kikuchi. Most people in the UK don't know of Takeo. Takeo is one of the first designers, the head of comm, to start coming to Europe with his fashion. Takeo was the designer who brought Ray Petrie and the whole Buffalo crew in the early 80s. He flew 30 people, dancers, models, singers, creatives to Tokyo to come and work on his show. Complete Anglophile. He loves what we create in the UK and the subcultures and the styles that we create. And so the first few shows in Tokyo were styled by Ray, and then for the following 25 years, he didn't show every year, but for every time that he would do, Barry Kamen, who was part of Buffalo, who's of recent sadly passed away, Barry did it for the following 25 years. Then 2 years ago, it was the 30th anniversary show, and Takeo, inspired by one of my other projects, asked if I would come and style his 30th anniversary show. So for me, with that kind of lineage and heritage of Ray, as I've said, quote unquote, not just because I like his work, but because of what he did within styling, then through Barry, a great artist, then for me to be able to come and style and work with Takeo. So the whole concept, I went to meet them in February, and they had this one gold crown on the invite that they were going to do. I then asked them if could we create maybe 500 of these gold crowns, because I wanted to make chainmail. So by the time I went back a month later, they'd created hundreds and hundreds of these gold crowns, and I worked with the artist Camo, and we created this punk aesthetic on the face. And the whole idea was that I would be able to try and sum up this 30-year lineage which references early Buffalo, the whole 80s, 90s, and where Takeo is today. A man who's in his late 70s, who still wears Air Force Ones, still really cool, probably one of the coolest people, if not the coolest person that I know, and is still really going for it, a man in his late 70s. So to be able to work with him and then bring Barry Kamen back in as well. So Barry did a lot of hand painting. And it's that point where I had all the pressure for what Buffalo and what those guys stand for, but to be able to bring in my own references, which take from Buffalo, take from street style, take from culture, take from elements, take from art. The cases, I was inspired by the artist Fontana, who takes canvases and will have block colours and will then just slice into the canvases. So we had 2 or 3 suitcases which we spray painted up, and then we would slice the suitcases in reference and homage to Fontana. So there's always that point where you're not always that excess is more, but the point where you're using everything that's around you, and there isn't necessarily one pinpointed thing. Maybe for another designer where I've done other projects, it's a bit more simplified, but for someone like this who's had this whole history, it's about putting a lot more into it. Here onto some more of my more recent commercial work. This is a campaign that I styled for Tom Brown that he did with this brand Koei in Japan. And again, it came through my Japan connections, and it's that point where Japan becomes, or mainly Tokyo, becomes my point of difference or part of my USP in comparison to my peers in the way that I work. And for me, it's always that point where how do you bring something new to the table? How do you make a lookbook not just look like everyone else's lookbook? And often it's really hard because clients will be quite specific. Tom Brown, for those of you, most of you I'm sure know, is really full on in what he does. And so Tom had designed this duck motif, and so I requested that we had a real live duck on set. Everyone thought I was a bit mad, but they went upstate New York. We shot it in New York last summer, and they managed to get this animal wrangler, and we had this duck, Reggie, who was there on the set for us to work with. So yeah, there's Reggie and Sarah and August the model. And then Tom, again, kind of culture of excess, insisted that we had loads of plastic ducks on set as well. So here's a campaign that I created for Adidas. Adidas launched this label called Adidas Blue a few years ago, but it was a range where it needed to find its own identity because they wanted to find or have this range which wouldn't have really obvious branding apart from on the trainers, a brand which would appeal to the influencers and those that maybe have grown up with Adidas and maybe wearing it, but as you get a bit older, maybe you don't want to wear big emblazoned logos across your sweatshirt. So it's hard to create and come up with a concept which will reflect their mission statement, which is live local but think global. So I cast Kazunori, Japanese model, and then Ainsley and Joanna. And it's that point where, again, casting is really, really important for all that I can do. And the further I go in my career, and now when people ask me to do what I do, casting has to be one of the key things. So no matter what kind of shoot you do, whether it be editorial for a commercial client, for me, the casting makes or break it. If someone turns up and they look amazing in a t-shirt, I then don't need to put a hat on them, or we then don't need to light them really specifically to make them look really good. It's really, excuse me, very much about what that person will bring to the table. And very often, I won't cast for this. These were all models at agencies, but the Kazunori I'd seen through some other friends. But it's very much that point that people who bring something real and will tell a different part of a story. Again, and this follows on here. After we finished shooting the Adidas campaign, I worked with a photographer called Dean Chalkley. Dean and I have worked together for about 10 years. We first started off shooting, I remember our first shoot was shooting this pop band in Ibiza for some pop magazine. And over the years, we would work together on and off, but Dean, a mod by not by definition, but yeah, he would call himself a mod, but very interested in culture and people and various different styles. And I remember while we were working on the Adidas campaign, there's one day he came to me and he said, I keep seeing all of these guys in these hats and looking really refined. And I said, look, I've seen a very similar thing, and to me it feels like Rude Boy. And so the previous year I'd been working with Puma on the Olympics, and the term Rude Boy had come up in some of the projects I'd been doing with them. And for those of you that don't know, the term Rude Boy originates from Jamaica in the late 1950s. Rude Boys were the men who ran the sound systems. They were they wouldn't have been gunslingers, but they would have been bad boys, they would have been wild boys, they would have been kind of petty, some of them petty criminals. But if I had a sound system running and somebody else had a sound system playing outside on a Saturday night, I want everyone to be coming to my party on a Saturday night, not to yours. So I'd maybe send my Rude Boys round to try and shut down your sound system. So, and then from the late 50s, there were a number of songs which would come out about all the different Rude Boys, so to put the terminology into context. So we created this project, Return of the Rude Boy, and it harks back, as I said, to the late 50s, that point where post-war Britain was in a bit of a situation where they were making these calls or these requests out to the Commonwealth and to these other nations to come over and try and help work here and try and help smooth things over, because the infrastructure needed to be rebuilt. So this kind of image, this kind of references the people that kind of fought the West Indians, who kind of fought alongside the British service personnel, and some of the people that would then make their way to the UK. The image on the right is Duke Reed, one of the earliest sound systems. And the image on the left, can anybody, don't be shy, tell me if they recognize the person who's in the middle? Yes! Normally people don't even know who that is. So before becoming a Rastafarian, Bob Marley was a Rude Boy. So his first album with Peter Tosh and Bunny Wailer, it was wearing the tonic suits and that Rude Boy style, which was way more refined, and they and many other artists would engage in songs which would either be pro or against the ways that the Rude Boys would conduct themselves. Then came this seminal film, The Harder They Come, 70s film starring Jimmy Cliff, which really epitomised, and those of you who haven't seen it, I would recommend. It's just a really great film which amazing soundtrack and really defines an era of the 70s. And then this image, which a lot of people don't realise, that point where our story becoming Return of the Rude Boy is very much a British story, and it's that point where immigrants come to this country, and then how those immigrants or those people would then mix with the British youth, or how the young British youth, like the mods, who would then go to the Jamaican dances, because the young Jamaicans wouldn't be allowed in white clubs, so they have to set up their own clubs, but the mods would be attracted by these new visitors who'd be here in the UK and be like, well, actually, we like some of what they've got, and so by definition, they're slightly rebellious because they're outside of the mold of what everyone's supposed to be doing. And then there became that impact on things like punk, like skinhead, and as I said, on mod. So Rude Boy for us was very much telling that story where Jamaicans, Caribbeans, and other nations then impacted on Britain, and it's that mixture between the two where the two cultures would collide and collaborate and create something new, which then led on to the late 70s, where this band, The Specials, which for me, quote unquote, is one of the most important things that happened in Britain in the 70s, because it was that time where people started to integrate off the back of seeing bands like the Specials, which would bring different races together. Because prior to that, there wouldn't be many occurrences or times where black people and white people would be together on the same stage performing. Yes, you'd have separate bands doing their thing, but not an integration like this. Jerry Dammers, who's one of the leading members of the Specials, also designed the two-tone logo. Two-tone, very obviously. The black and white checker is about black and white mixing together and getting on together. And again, it's that point where, pretty much like Judy with Massive Attack, Jerry being a musician, producer and DJ, then also designs this logo. And it's that point where if you've got an idea and you want to execute it, you put it all together. So onto the exhibition that we did. It spanned 5 rooms at Somerset House. It ran for 10 weeks. And we created each room to tell a different part of the story of the Rude Boy. So this was from room 1, which we called the room which is about migration. So I curated and designed these 2 suitcase totems which reference the early suitcases that those visitors would have had coming here in that time. And then we also used them, obviously, here as picture frames as well. On the left, you've got room 2, which is a tailoring room, where I'd commissioned Art Comes First to create those 4 outfits. Art Comes First is another duo who you should check out. Very influential menswear creatives, auteurs, Renaissance men doing what they do. And the outfits that they created very much define that point where you've taken a classic English tailcoat and then sleeves are cut off and then you put leather sleeves. Yes, you're seeing a lot of these things already on the high street, but you've also got to understand where a lot of these things originate from and the people that are actually creating these things. And then you have like the MA1 jacket, which you associate back to Buffalo or to the American military, and then you've got the mod parka. And so there's all of these different elements which taking references of style, taking elements of design, elements of culture. And then here we've got these shoes, which were by the brand Mr. Hare, which were customized by Barry Kamen, who I've mentioned earlier. And here we've got room 3, which was the barbershop. When I've been working for Puma, I came up with this concept of having a barbershop, which kind of fell flat, but I was determined to bring this barbershop back in. So we had the barbershop, which was open 2 days a week, so you could come in on a Thursday or Saturday. Doesn't matter if you're black, white, male, female. The iconography and imagery on the walls is referencing Rude Boy, but anyone could come in and get their hair done. But then down to the detailing on the trunks that we found and sourced, the interior of the trunk we had recustomized by a friend of ours who does book binding and so forth. So it's always that point of taking something and not accepting it as it is and reappropriating it and making it your own. Everyone uses the adage that everything's already been done. Yes, no, whatever, don't really care. But what you do with something, and when you add your own stamp onto it and you tell your story with it, that's what becomes fresh and what makes it real for you and then can be represented for others. These are some of the other images from the exhibition. We had over 60 images, and then we had the amazing fortune of taking the show to Tokyo. And Takeo Kikuchi, who I mentioned before, who I collaborate with, also was one of the main sponsors for bringing Return of the Rude Boy to Tokyo. Japanese, very early adopters, always embraced, so I kind of pretty much knew that they would probably embrace it first. And then Marc Jacobs heard about us coming to Tokyo, so they wanted to launch the book. So we didn't have a book when we did the exhibition in London, but we launched the book at Bookmark, Marc Jacobs in Tokyo. Here we jump on to Kate Tempest. This is Kate Tempest, poet, author, playwright, rapper, for the Mercury Music Awards about, I think, 3 years ago. Kate and her manager came to Return of the Rude Boy, really loved it, got in contact with me and asked if I would work with Kate. Kate hails from South London, like myself. We get on really well. Kate normally doesn't really care what she does regarding style and image, because for her, it's all about the content. The visual doesn't really matter because it's about her words that mean something. But for the Mercuries, she wanted to do something. So I came up with the idea of doing a teddy boy suit for her. She still refused to have any makeup, but we had her hair done, and we had this teddy boy suit made for her. But then you can just about see I still had her wearing the shell toes underneath. So again, you're mixing it up. You're bringing Teddy, but you're still keeping it true to who these people are. So then she doesn't feel completely out of place because she always wears trainers. Next project after Return of the Rude Boy was Punk in Translation. I was approached by a division of the Japanese government called Leather Japan to create this project which essentially looked at how they work with leather and what they do with their leather workmanship. I kind of thought just working with leather in itself would be a little bit boring, but how do we tell this story through culture? Knowing that some of the guys who are part of Leather Japan are part of the Tokyo punk scene, I said we need to do a punk project, and where we used leather, which we associate with punks and the punk garments, and this group, Black Means, an amazing design studio from Tokyo, they make this really intricate studded leather. And so let's tell the story of your leather workmanship through these images of Japanese punk and Japanese punk culture. So flew out to Tokyo in the October, went to a number of punk festivals and gigs. And these are some of the images from the gigs and the festivals. The one on the bottom right was from the actual exhibition that we put on. And then those are three of the members of Black Means. And then this board is by, which is also for the project, this is by a photographer called Tatsuo Suzuki. Tatsuo's work I'd seen on Instagram probably about 6 months before I got asked to do the project. Stumbled across his work, started following him, and decided at one of my trips to Tokyo, I really have to work with him because I love his aesthetic. So when this project came about, I then fought to have Tatsuo work on the project. I went backwards and forwards, and then I really dug my heels in and said, I'm not doing any more on the project unless we get Tatsuo on, because I really believe that his work really gives off the essence of what punk is about. And so Tatsuo is a photographer. He's a man in his early 50s who, up until 3 years ago, was an office man, regular office job, worked at Fujitsu, picked up a camera about 5-6 years ago and would take pictures on the weekend. A couple of years ago, he decided, you know what, I've had enough of this office work. I really love taking images. So after 30-odd years of having a proper decent job, decides I just really love taking images. So he spends 5 days a week on the streets of Shibuya, in Shinjuku, different districts within Tokyo, taking different street style pictures of people, but very much like a sniper. It's not your blog style kind of silly whatever kind of images of people outside shows. It's very much about the everyday, but I can feel the energy in his images. And so Punk in Translation was the first commission that he had ever had. And then since then, we've gone on to shoot a few other editorial projects. And we're now working on another idea that I've got, which looks at a different aspect of Japanese culture. And again, it's that point where your source material can be anywhere. Where you find something, where you see something, how you collaborate with something. There isn't a set path, there isn't a set route or a set way. Your antennas always have to be up, your eyes always need to be open, not down just in your phone. Yes, I found him on Instagram, but it's generally because you're looking, you're aware, and you're seeing what's going on. These images are by an artist called Peter Kennard, and I've been inspired by Peter's work for quite a few years via a brand that I used to work with, and this kind of links into Kate Tempest, because beginning of last year, Kate got in contact. She said, I want you to art direct my new album campaign. And I've art directed photo shoots, fashion shoots, and anything within that realm, but haven't really done anything musically within a 2D format. But she said, look, I love what you do. We work really well together, so I really want you to do this. So I contacted Peter Kennard, got him involved, and then created all of the album and single artwork for Kate Tempest's album, which was launched in October last year. The album's called Let Them Eat Chaos, and it takes some of Peter's archive imagery. He didn't create anything new for the stills, but then we went on to other things where we created new things. And I'm not a graphic designer, would never pretend that I am, but because of the story aspect of the album, I wanted the fonts to be like tabloids. So I then found all my references, knew the way I wanted to work. Kate's name doesn't actually appear on the album other than within a sticker. That's just the original artwork, but it's just like a see-through sticker which gets peeled off when you open the cellophane off of the album. But the whole point is about the art being there and the image being the most important thing. And what she says is very much about now and how we all spend our times gazing into our phones when there's a world which is imploding around us. But so often we're too busy looking at our social medias and our status updates to notice that the world's crumbling. But so working with Peter was a great thing. The images on the left are part of the gatefold album cover that I designed. And when you open the gatefold album, I'd created these 8 windows, and each window you open refers to a different character on the album. And these are some of the quotes that from each of the different characters' songs. This is a big performance that we did for the BBC, where I created a lot of visuals. Should be something. So I took Peter Kennard's images and we photographed things around us, and we went down to the beach, we filmed the sea, and yeah, so like Peter's image, we there turned it into a smoking globe. And so now Peter and I have formed this new relationship where he, if you Google him, is dubbed as Britain's most important political artist. He's been making imagery since 1968, hard-hitting anti-war or socio-political imagery. And now working with me, it's the first time that his work has ever been animated, so which has really inspired him to start doing new work. And so we're now working on new projects where we create things where we can either animate his own work or we create new concepts together. Kind of starting to wrap up now. I was a late adopter to social media. I hated Facebook, couldn't understand Twitter, but jumped onto Instagram about 3-4 years ago. And usually, or as much as possible, I turn my Instagram into these 12-block storyboards. Sometimes it's a block of 9, but it's very much partly maybe where I've not had my website up, but partly wanting my Instagram to be that point where you can either tell elements of the stories that you create or showing some of your work and where you intermix different things. So yeah, this is the last slide, but there's elements from press. There on the left, you've got Kasabian, anti-fascism, and then where that was just after one of the first Paris attacks, but it's how you then mix in different images about what's going on to tell a particular story. No, it's not really blatantly obvious to others, but it's the way that I curate things and put things together. They're mixed in with Erykah Badu, who I mentioned earlier, and those flowers. But yeah, this is my final slide. That's me, Harris Elliott, visual storyteller, signing out.